In the 21st century, those who change the world are those who change the culture. They get people in sync, lead tribes, create movements, and generate an energy field where ordinary people achieve extraordinary results.
This, culture change, in my perspective, is something that happens very gradually and can, sometimes you don't notice it until one day your employee says to you, oh, I was going to ask you this thing, but then I just asked it to myself because I knew you were going to ask me that. And I have clients say that to me all the time, that their employee said that to them, and that it was such a fun moment, a very joyous moment for both of them, because it just showed that by practicing certain frameworks and by practicing certain habits, that we end up training ourselves and building in habits that we are glad that we have now.
This episode is brought to you by Time, Etc., an award-winning virtual assistant company for entrepreneurs. If you are a freelancer or an entrepreneur like me, and you feel like you could do with some extra help from a virtual assistant, Time, Etc. has a very generous offer. It's exclusive for the listeners of Culture Lab, and you can try an assistant for 2 hours completely free of charge. To take advantage of this opportunity, go to www.timeetc.com/culturelab. That's www.timeetc.com/culturelab. Or you can just click on the link in the show notes. I'm Aga Bayer, and this is the Culture Lab podcast, where you will find ideas and inspiration on how to harness the power of team and organizational culture. I talk to leadership thinkers, culture experts, entrepreneurs, and all sorts of movers and shakers, and together we explore the fascinating topic of culture, leadership, and personal growth. If you like what you hear, subscribe to the podcast on iTunes. Or better yet, write a review on iTunes and share the podcast with your followers and friends on social media. For more, check out our archive at www.agabayer.com/podcast. Hello and welcome to episode 33. Our today's guest is Wes Kao, a marketing strategy expert who helps challenger brands maximize their product launches. Wes helps clients build high-performing launch teams and create marketing engines that drive growth. And as she told me, it often entails working on their culture as well. Previously, Wes was the founding executive director of Seth Godin's Alt MBA, which is a leadership and management program for innovators, entrepreneurs, executives, and change agents. And she helped Alt MBA to grow from 0 to 550 cities in 45 countries. And that was done in under 3 years. Before this, Wes held leadership roles in marketing at Flight, which was acquired by Snapchat, Berry Essentials, L'Oreal, and Gap. So when I look at the three things that we talk about with Wes Kao in our interview, brand identity, marketing, and culture, all I see are endless interdependencies. When you come to think of it, who we are and what we stand for has a huge impact on how our company is perceived by its customers and its ability to succeed in the market. Wes and I talk about a wide variety of topics during this interview. Some of the things that we discuss is the power of asking the what-if question, and that was particularly interesting to see when Wes is describing how she set up a charity. We talked about the importance of trust in marketing, in branding, and in building culture. We touched upon the importance of social proof and building credibility in building a brand, but also in a marketing strategy. Empathy was one of the topics that we touch upon, and how to get anyways buy-in and get projects successfully off the ground by de-risking ideas and proactively overcoming objections. There's many more things that we talk about. For Seth Godin's fans, heads up, she is also talking about his approach to shaping the culture in his own team. Have a listen. Here is Wes Kao. Hello, Wes, and welcome to Culture Lab.
Hey, August, super excited to be here.
Yeah, it's wonderful to have you with us. I'm really keen to talk to you about culture and about marketing and the intersection of both. But before we dive into that, would you be able to give our listeners just a very short introduction to who you are and what you do?
Sure. I'm a growth marketing strategist, and I work with challenger brands that need to build trust with their customers because they're launching either in a new category or new type of product. And I spent the last 10 years working in-house on a bunch of brands, including Gap, L'Oreal, startup acquired by Snapchat, with Seth Godin on the Alt MBA. And now I'm working directly with clients.
Wonderful. And it sounds extremely interesting, the challenge that you set out at the beginning, which is brands that need to gain trust. So I'm really curious to learn more about that. But before we go there, one more question, sort of focusing on your past rather than your present, which is, what were the early cultural influences that shaped you as a person? What made Wes Wes?
So one of my early cultural influences is being a middle child. So I have an older brother, and I remember when we used to play or fight, I would get in trouble, and I would totally say, "Oh, my brother hit me," and it was funny because then my sister came along, my little sister, and she within a couple of years she would do the same thing. She would say, "Well, Wes hit me. What's that?" And I would say, "No, I didn't. That's not true." And so just being the middle child and seeing both sides of a story and being able to feel both sides. I think it's not just intellectually understanding, but really feeling, okay, so this is what it feels like being on the other side. That was a very big cultural influence on me because so much of marketing is being able to empathize with your customer and being able to empathize with people, whether they're your customer or not, being able to understand why they're hesitant about a new idea, or why something feels risky, or why they're afraid of being judged by the people they care about, and approaching that with empathy and with understanding, not with with judgment about them, and why can't they just understand this new technology. So I think that empathy piece really stemmed from being a middle child and being able to see multiple sides of the situation.
Yeah, I love that. And I have to be honest, I don't have brothers or sisters. So I think probably the empathy piece was harder for me to get. And I never thought about being a middle child and what it can do for you. But as you explained it, and being part of that process of having something done to you by your big brother and then having similar issues with your little sister, I think it totally makes sense. I can see how that would make you more sensitive to other perspectives in life. So that's fascinating. Thanks for sharing that. So I'm curious, what drew you to marketing? Was it a single event in your life when you said, oh, wow, this is fascinating? Or was it more of a gradual process?
It was more of a gradual process, but there was definitely an event that encouraged me very much to go in the direction of marketing. And that was when I was in high school, when I was 16 years old, I founded a nonprofit charity, and I was donating backpacks and school supplies to underprivileged children. And that experience was very formative for me because I learned everything through trial and error. I made all the mistakes the wrong way. I was sending, general form letters asking for donations to big companies, sending it to their general mailbox, not addressing it even to a specific person or a specific department. I was going around door to door to different stores like Walmart and Target and Longstrugs asking for donations without thinking about how that store manager would view my credibility as someone, without an organization or affiliation with an established nonprofit, saying, "Hey, can you give me backpacks and pencils and pens and highlighters and notebooks?" And so there were a lot of tears involved in that. There was a lot of mistakes and just slogging through it. But at the end of the day, I realized that the way that I told the story of Packs of Love, that was the name of the charity, and the story of what I was trying to do and the people that I wanted to help really changed the way that people saw this idea and saw me. And it was a powerful reminder that it's not just whether your idea is good and whether your intentions are good. You really have to work on connecting the dots for your audience so that they understand and see for themselves why this matters and what their role can be in making this dream a reality. So I ran this nonprofit for 5 years through the beginning of college, and eventually we donated thousands of backpacks, all filled with school supplies. We were covered in the news by NBC. I was on the front page of newspapers. All of this was very helpful in giving credibility. And I remember actually at the time feeling a little bit guilty that I was getting press. And, did that mean that this wasn't a good enough idea on its own, that it didn't just sell itself, that I needed to show, these newspaper clippings to companies when I was asking for donations because it helped with the credibility. And now looking back, this is something that I teach all of my clients, is that social proof is absolutely important. We as humans love social proof. We love knowing that other people like us have donated, that this organization was legitimate enough to be covered in the press or to have donations from other stationery companies or stores. And social proof is absolutely one of the tools that you can use as a marketer and as a change agent. So there's, in looking back, there's so many threads that I was learning through trial and error that are core principles of marketing that still apply today.
Yeah, that's so fascinating. And there's so much stuff that I would like to unpack there, because I think all that storytelling piece and helping people to understand why and what role they can play in this, and then gaining the social proof as well, are very, very relevant to shaping culture within organizations as well. And we'll go there, I'm sure. But before we go there, I'm really curious, because you say you started this non-profit when you were 16. So what made you want to do this?
Well, one day, my dad walked into my room when I was cleaning my desk and organizing all my stuff. And, at the time I had a ton of Hello Kitty pencils and notebooks, and I had basically dumped it all out on the floor and was reorganizing my stuff. And he basically started giving me a lecture that he had given me many, many times in years past of, you are so lucky, you have all these things, we let you buy all these things. There's so many kids who don't have this. And usually when he gave me those lectures, I just kind of nodded and smiled until he went away and continued doing whatever I was doing. But this time after he left, I continued thinking about what he said, and I realized that he was right, that I was very lucky, that I had all of these beautiful notebooks and pens and pencils, and I was really into collecting stationery at the time. And I acknowledged that yes, there were kids out there who didn't have this. And when I thought about the excitement that I had about the beginning of the school year, so much of that was tied in the idea of fresh beginnings, the idea of, this is the year that I can be the person that I wanted to be, and I was always so excited about that. And I think many, many students are. And
oh yeah, definitely. I can relate to that.
right. Yeah. And
yeah.
but then when you think about, if you don't have the right school supplies, or, if you don't have a backpack, or you don't feel ready for the school year, it's so psychological. And I realized that there were other students out there who were very much like me, except they didn't have these school supplies that could help them feel excited about the new year, that would help them feel prepared to tackle the new challenges entering a new grade. And so I thought, okay, what if I donated some of these school supplies to kids who needed them? And what if I, instead of just donating the extra supplies that I had, what if I collected them from other classmates of mine who had extra supplies and grew up in privileged environments, who wanted to give back? And so I started thinking about making this a bigger thing, and what could the first step be? And I got really excited about this idea. And of course, from the idea into it being a reality was light years apart, as I soon found out.
I can imagine.
But that was the way that it originally started.
Mm-hmm. Wow, what a story. And yeah, I can totally see how you would get into marketing through that project. And you did say it lasted 4 years or 5 years?
5 years, yeah.
5 years. Incredible. Incredible story. So you get that experience and you realize how important it is to be able to tell a compelling story and give people the why and show them how they could be part of that vision. And what happens then in terms of your journey with marketing? How did you continue your marketing career?
Mm-hmm. I continued my marketing career after college by working at the Gap headquarters in San Francisco. And that was a formative experience too, because I did a rotational training program where I rotated between Gap, Old Navy, Banana Republic, so all the core Gap brands. And it was an incredible experience, again, diving into empathy and understanding the customer, because Old Navy has a different price point than Gap, which has a different price point than Banana Republic, which is more premium. And I remember thinking at the time, Old Navy, it's mass. Is that, is the product really elevated? And, I want to work on Banana Republic because it's a more luxurious brand. And through the process of working at the Gap, I really got an appreciation for understanding brands at all levels of price points and at different levels of the market, and how wonderful it is really to have great design at an affordable price point. So Old Navy ended up being one of the brands that I loved working on the most, because when at Old Navy, we translated styles that were usually only at higher end brands into price points that were affordable for people to try out. So if you're not sure if you like sequins, or you're not sure if you like fringe, or whatever the latest trend is of the day, you can get to try it out. And so I really built that marketing muscle at the Gap at a traditional retailer, and again at Bare Essentials, which is a makeup company, a cosmetics company that got acquired by Shiseido. Again, doing brand management marketing, working on product launches, both new launches and relaunches, looking at the categories of makeup that we were in and how to grow our presence, especially in established categories where we were already the market leader, and wanted to protect that position. And so throughout my career, whether it was in the beginning, kind of in corporate retail, or more recently within the startup world, working in ad tech, working with Seth Godin on an education tech platform, a lot of it has been around how do we connect with the customer and really understand their worldview, and not try to change it. I think so much of our energy is spent thinking about, well, how do I change this person? How do I get them to want the thing that I have? And instead, I think we should spend more time thinking about who already wants this thing that I have, who would be excited by what I'm bringing to the table, and then do a better job of finding those people and telling them stories that would help them better understand what we're about and what we can offer them that makes their life better.
Yeah. And it's interesting because I think this piece, what we're about and who we are, is this intersection at the intersection of brand and culture, isn't it? Because in order to be able to bring this offering to life for your customers, you have to be this thing internally as well. So I'm really curious about your experiences there, because we did have a chat about culture and how you see that. What do you have to say about that intersection of brand identity, marketing, and culture?
I think brand identity, culture, marketing are all so interrelated because what you believe and who you are permeates everything that you do in big ways and in small ways, even in ways that you're not consciously thinking about. It gets expressed in the actions that you take, in the words that you do. And especially when it comes to marketing, there is such a broad definition of what is considered ethical, what is considered marketing with integrity and with an ethical approach. And I know of companies that would rather take a shortcut and spam people or trick them into into clicking purchase. And then it's like, okay, so no refunds, or we intentionally had this fine print about how you have to cancel the subscription within 2 weeks, and if not, we're going to bill you per month after that. And they do this knowing that people are not going to read the fine print, and people are signing up on their phones, clicking with their thumbs and not reading very carefully. And all of this is kind of unethical depending on who you ask. So that aspect of corporate culture becomes so important, because as an organization and as a leader in an organization, you really have to ask yourself, what do we stand for? And what are our self-inflicted guardrails? If someone else isn't going to regulate us, that doesn't mean that we can just say whatever we want and do whatever we want, right? And so I think having a strong point of view about what are our values about short-term versus long-term gain, and when are there times when we're going to prioritize intentionally our long-term relationship with the customer and our long-term reputation as a brand over these short-term gains. These are all questions that are very much at the heart of corporate culture.
Absolutely. And you did mention when we had our previous chat that when you work with your clients today, helping them gain customers' trust fast, you find that very often the key obstacle to accomplishing that is actually their culture.
Yes.
So how does that stand in the way? Can you give us some examples of the companies that you work with where you realize that actually probably we need to start first with your culture and then talk about the rest of it?
Mm-hmm. Usually it's not a lack of good ideas about solving a problem. It's the lack of buy-in internally, the lack of alignment of the people that need to say yes in order for this idea to move forward. So recognizing that it's not just about, hey, I have a great idea, or hey, my team has a great idea, now everyone needs to listen to us or fund this project internally. Recognizing that is a huge step and a huge leap forward. Because when you acknowledge that it's not just about whether your idea is technically correct or technically the best solution, you can then shift your work into helping your team members, helping your senior leaders, helping your peers, helping your direct reports, helping everyone in the organization understand why this idea needs to happen and how it benefits both your customers and the different teams internally.
And I suppose that, again, probably what helps you to convince your colleagues or other stakeholders within the company that the idea is good is really being able to tell a good story about it.
Yes, absolutely. It's being able to tell a good story, but more than that, it's being able to appeal to the specific audience that you're speaking to. And that audience a lot of times is your boss. So how do you de-risk this idea for your boss? When your boss hears this new idea, what they're thinking is, great, Jim wants to do this risky idea. He doesn't really know if it's going to work. If it fails, I'm going to have to clean it up. My plate is already so full. So it's really easier for me as the boss to say, you know what, Jim, why don't we put this on the back burner? Let's revisit this, next quarter. And why don't you just continue doing the things that we had said we wanted to do before?
This episode is brought to you by Time Etc., an award-winning virtual assistant company for entrepreneurs. I started using Time Etc. a couple of months after I established my own consulting business. I reached out to them because, like many entrepreneurs out there, I felt completely overwhelmed with work. I was putting in incredibly long hours, I wasn't sleeping enough, I was working on the weekends, and yet it seemed completely impossible to get it all done. It got to a point where I knew that something was going to give sooner or later, so I decided to get some help. Initially, I started working with one Time Etc. assistant, and I quickly realized that it made a huge difference. So many things were taken care of, from scheduling appointments to arranging travel, updating my website, formatting documents. It saved hours of time that I could spend serving my clients, recharging my batteries, and simply enjoying hanging out with my loved ones. As my business started growing, my team grew too. Now I have 3 assistants, and honestly, I can't imagine my life without them. Time Etc. has a very strict selection process, so the assistants working for them are extremely experienced, capable, and motivated. What I also love is the fact that Time Etc. creates the opportunity for really talented individuals to be location independent or to work from home. It's always been an important thing for me to work from wherever I wanted, and I love the fact that my team has the same opportunity. If you are a freelancer or an entrepreneur like me, and you feel like you could do with some extra help from a virtual assistant, Time Etc. has a very generous offer exclusively for the listeners of Culture Lab. You can try an assistant for 2 hours completely free of charge. To take advantage of this opportunity, go to www.timeetc.com/culturelab. That's www.timeetc.com/culturelab. Or you can just click on the link in the show notes. I think a lot of our listeners are probably now starting to listen very carefully, because just from the conversations that I have occasionally with our listeners, I know that people really struggle with getting senior leadership buy-in very often, whether it's for an innovative idea, a new product, or even the need for shifting culture. So what are effective ways of de-risking great ideas when you talk to your boss?
That's a great question. And I'll throw out a couple examples of possible ideas that you might be wanting to de-risk. And these are based on clients that I've worked with and recent examples. So let's say you want to start a webinar series or a podcast series for your brand. So that's an example of a new idea. Another new idea is you want to take the product messaging in a different direction. And that requires updating your website and your packaging, your social media, everything with this new messaging. Okay, those are just 2 ideas of new examples that I wanted to throw out as, examples of, here's some ideas that you might be wanting to push forward that senior leadership might say, well, maybe let's just put that off and do it later. So let's say you have these ideas. So what are things that you can do to de-risk them and make them more appealing for your boss or your peers, let's say your senior level peers, that you need to get their support from engineering, from product development to help you with this? What are things that you can do? So first, the general idea is that you want to make it easier for people to say yes than it is to say no. At the core, that is really what gets someone to say yes is, if it's easier for me to say yes to you, then I'm going to say yes to you. If I have any reasons to say no, I'm just going to say no. So that sounds kind of simple, but that's the first principle is, how can we make it easier for people to say yes? And one great way of doing that is by thinking ahead 10 steps about all the ways that this could go wrong. Because trust me, when you bring this idea to your boss or to your cross-functional team member and say, hey, I want to try this thing. I need to tap, 20 hours per week of your team's resources to work on this. They're already thinking, why should I do this? I can see 5 reasons why this won't work, and a million more reasons why the work that we're currently doing is already more of a priority. So think 10 steps ahead about all the ways that this could go wrong. And then for all of those ways, think of solutions of how you would mitigate those risks. So if your boss is worried that, hey, if we launch a webinar, no one's going to come and this is going to be really embarrassing for us, right? Like that's a legitimate concern. And we don't want our brand to look bad if no one shows up. Okay, so what are ways that we can de-risk that idea? Maybe it's saying, all right, we're going to make sure that there's at least 20 people there. And we're going to plant these listeners. They're partially going to be some friends, plus, some customers that we already have, plus employees. So we're going to make sure that there's enough people there that people are going to be, asking questions via instant message so everyone else can see that there's people. We're going to have a list of questions that we draft up for ourselves. So when we go over, okay, who has questions? All right, here are some that were previously submitted. We already have a list of questions. It's not going to be radio silence because that would be awkward. So it's thinking of solutions to possible objections and fears that are very much real. So that's the biggest thing that you can do, is thinking about what are ways that this could go wrong, and then how can I solve these? And part 2 of that is, how can I take responsibility if it goes wrong, and then give credit and kudos and all the glory to my boss and to my coworkers if it goes right.
That's a really juicy one.
It's hard. It's really hard to think about doing that.
Yeah. Yeah. So tell me a little bit more about that. So what would be an example of that?
Well, an example would be, let's say your boss says, fine, I'll give you the green light to do the webinar. And it ends up working. People show up, more people than you expect show up. People are engaged, they're asking questions, and you want to turn this into a regular occurrence, maybe a bi-weekly event. And instead of saying to your boss and your coworkers, look at me, remember how I wanted to do this idea and I told you this was going to be smart, and look, it was smart. I was so smart. Like, that's usually, we don't necessarily say those words, but a lot of the time our posture says that, which is kind of like, I told you so, right? So we want to not do the I told you so and basically do the exact opposite, which is, oh my gosh, boss and coworkers, you guys were so forward thinking in supporting this idea. And here are the ways that it went right? And then you can give a couple examples of why it was successful, and then say, given that you were willing to support this at the early stages when it was, barely an idea, now that we have an example of it working, I think we should continue doing this. And I want to do this, every 2 weeks. Are you on board with this? This doesn't take any additional work on your end. I'm going to run it. If I need anything specific, I'll bring it up to you with enough advance notice that it won't add any additional work on your plate. But this is something that our customers are really, really liking. And with your blessing, I would love to continue this.
And I can also imagine that it sounds really difficult to our listeners, right? Because you really have to put your ego on the side and really focus on the project rather than putting yourself in, in the good light and being the hero, and so on and so forth. And as you say, giving credit to others, which sometimes for most of us can be challenging.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And I suppose that if you do it regularly, then you also build a reputation that helps you to introduce new ideas in the future.
Yes, that's a great point. When you lead small projects over and over and you are constantly known as the one that can try out a new idea and get buy-in from the people around you and help make your team and your company look good, your boss and your peers tend to trust you more with bigger and bigger projects. So that's really the beauty of this, is when you take responsibility one small bite at a time and you're willing to put your ego aside, you eventually get bigger and bigger chunks that that you can bite into, and all of that accumulates and snowballs into making some big change within a company.
Yeah, I love that. And you talked about a webinar or some other ideas, new products perhaps within a company, but I can very easily see how that would work exactly the same way with ideas of how to shape or improve company culture. So for anyone listening, if you have an idea of how to improve your company culture, I think you can definitely follow Wes's ideas on how to de-risk the whole thing. Another question that I have is about this idea of building an intentional culture. And we had this chat where you sort of mentioned that it really is important to build a culture with a clear intention. And I'm wondering, do you have any examples to share on how your customers or the companies that you worked for in the past built a culture with a very specific intention, and it really became a driving force for them, rather than just being something nice to have?
There was a company that I started working with recently on their mission, vision, and values. So that was the original reason that we started having a conversation. But it soon morphed, because what was the true root of the issue was that the leadership team thought, if we write down what our mission, vision, and values are, that's good enough. That people will read this and they will understand what this company is about and how we want our teams to act.
Yeah, if only.
Right. And it's of course, as you can imagine, it didn't end
Yeah.
up turning out that way. And when we dug deeper, they revealed that the challenge that they were really facing was they were growing as a company, doubling in size, and the processes that used to work weren't really working anymore. The core team couldn't do everything themselves anymore. So they were bringing on new team members, but these new team members were doing work that sometimes felt sloppy or not aligned with the overall vision, or showed that they didn't really understand the purpose of what they were hired to do. And so it created a lot of extra work for these core team members, because they would constantly have to fix their direct reports' mistakes and whatnot, and kind of jump in when they really wanted to focus on growing other areas. And so this started a great conversation about how just because you write something down doesn't make it culture. And just because something is culture doesn't mean that it has to be written. So,
Yeah, absolutely.
right? And so a lot of what we worked on was thinking about the outcome of what behavior do you want to see differently for your direct reports. So we're kind of taking a huge step back here. So instead of jumping to the solution of saying we want to work on mission, vision, and values, we're taking a huge step back and saying, okay, at the end of the day, you essentially want your new direct reports and your new team members to do work that you don't have to fix as often, because they're thinking ahead and correcting a lot of the potential errors and logical gaps themselves before bringing it to you. So that's eventually the behavior that you want to see. So given that that's the case, how do we develop a process and a culture and an approach that helps these new team members better act in that way? So we worked backwards from there, and what we came up with was training 3 distinct types of people within the company on acting differently, so on behavior change. One was the CFO himself. So he would often jump in and start telling people exactly what to do and start micromanaging. So part 1 was training the CFO to not do that and to use self-restraint, to hold back when he knew the answer and wanted to just tell people what the answer was, and to train him on how to let the direct reports think for themselves. So that was one. The second part was the middle managers, some of the core team members, training them on how to manage up to the CFO, because they were reporting into him and needed to make sure he felt in the loop. And then also how to manage downwards to their direct reports to get better work out of them, and how to use a Socratic line of questioning called rigorous thinking, which I'll talk about in a second. And then part 3 was training the actual direct reports on what are tools and frameworks that they can use in their daily work so that they are thinking ahead and doing the things we talked about earlier, taking responsibility if something doesn't work, de-risking ideas, so that by the time they show their boss and the CFO, that their ideas are in a tighter place. So it's really translating that culture into 3 distinct types of employees within the company, and then how do you want each person's behavior to change?
Yeah. And what I hear you say here is that you address a knowledge gap that potentially people might have. And I can see how that can be done through training. But you are aiming also to address, let's say, the habit gap, so habit formation, because I imagine it's one thing to know what's the right way to think or what's the right thing to behave, like, for example, not to give those solutions, as in the case of the CFO. But then I would be also very, very curious, how did they go about turning this understanding and the knowledge into actual behaviors and potentially also habitual behaviors? Because I suppose that would be success of that.
Yes. The habit piece is the most important piece. If we know something but we don't do it on a regular basis, what's the point? Does it even really mean we know it at all? And I think the best approach there is thinking both about confidence and competence. So does the person have the skill to be able to do this? And do they feel confident in trying this new skill? And do they have that psychological safety? So, with the CFO, breaking it down and making it really simple and saying, anytime that he feels that visceral reaction to jump in and answer someone's question and tell them what to do, to pause and say, what do you think we should do? To ping that question back to that person when they're asking, hey, CFO, I have this problem. What should I do? He already has 5 answers in his head, but instead of just jumping in, to pause and say, okay, whenever I feel this urge to just respond, I'm going to pause. And the next thing I should do is always ping back the question, what do you think we should do?
So it's anchored in self-awareness, right? And self-observation first. So we really need to be self-aware and notice that urge first, and then to have an alternative behavior to your habitual behavior, basically.
Exactly.
Which is, as you say, to ping this question to your team.
To understand the trigger, and then to have an alternative ready at your fingertips. And of course, there are so many other questions and frameworks for drawing answers out of your team members, but having one to kick you off can be really helpful, because that's your go-to. And once you kick it off by asking, what do you think we should do? The other person starts talking, you start seeing that, oh, wow, they actually have thought about this. So you trust them a little bit more, and then you can have a real conversation. So it really shifts that behavior.
So have you been able to follow up with that specific client and see whether the culture changed indeed, or, over the months or years after you worked with them?
Absolutely. This, culture change, in my perspective, is something that happens very gradually and can, sometimes you don't notice it until one day your employee says to you, oh, I was going to ask you this thing, but then I just asked it to myself because I knew you were going to ask me that. And I have clients say that to me all the time, that their employee said that to them, and that it was such a fun moment, a very joyous moment for both of them, because it just showed that by practicing certain frameworks and by practicing certain habits, that we end up training ourselves and building in habits that we are glad that we have now.
Yeah. Awesome. Love that. So, one question that I have to ask you, because otherwise I think our listeners would never forgive me, is about your work with Seth Godin. And for those listeners who are not aware of who Seth Godin is, he's the father of modern marketing and a really, really influential thinker who has shaped my thinking as well. And I participated in the marketing seminar twice. I'm a huge fan. And I know that Seth talks and writes a lot about culture. So I'm really, really curious, Wes, how does he go about shaping a culture in his team?
That's a great question. So you'll have to ask him that also yourself one of these days.
Yes, I will.
But I can speak as someone who worked closely with him on his leadership team. And my takeaway from working with Seth and his approach on culture is that he really walks the talk. More than anyone that I've met, he is so incredibly consistent with what he preaches and what he actually lives and breathes and encourages in his team. And I have one example of that really brings this to life, which is, I think so many of us from previous jobs, from school and since childhood, have gotten these mini wrist slaps for speaking up, for speaking the truth, or for having a new idea, or for being different. And from that, we get scars or calluses, and we're afraid of speaking up. And, when I first joined the team, Seth was very explicit about wanting me to speak up and wanting to make sure that whatever crazy idea that I had, that I felt like there was psychological safety for me to say that crazy idea. And that also the idea probably wasn't as crazy as I thought it was compared to some of his ideas. And so I think that, that was huge, because it took some unlearning, it took some rewriting and rewiring of my brain to really trust that this was a place where I could raise my hand and object, if I disagreed with an idea, that he and I could debate on something and both feel respected, that I wasn't going to get in trouble for saying, hey, I don't think this is a good idea, and here's why, to my boss. And I think that culture of encouraging people to speak up, of encouraging people to share ideas openly and iterate on them quickly, really shaped my thinking about culture and developing a culture of rigorous thinking, and what it takes to build enough trust with a team where, when you debate with each other, when you have a differing point of view, that it's not seen as an attack or, oh, this person doesn't trust me, or this person doesn't like my work. It's actually interpreted as the opposite, which is, wow, this person and my team really trusts me enough for us to speak openly and separate our emotions and our ego from this idea. And that was a huge cultural component of us, just separating that ego from the actual work.
I have a feeling, Wes, that trust is one of the really important elements or aspects of your work and your approach to marketing, as well as probably to shaping culture. So, first of all, first question, am I right? Am I on the right track? And if yes, what's the reason that you focus so much on building trust?
Trust is absolutely at the foundation of everything, whether it's marketing or personal relationships or your relationship with your boss. I can't overemphasize how important trust is, and I think it's something that that from a cultural perspective, we all agree intellectually and theoretically that yes, of course, trust is important, but on a lived basis, on a day-to-day basis, you can probably think of the coworkers that you've had in previous jobs or in your current job where you trust them. You just trust them. You trust that you can tell them the truth, or that you can give them feedback, or that they will give you the benefit of the doubt when you're being honest. And that level of closeness, of psychological safety, really is the foundation of building a great company and doing great work, because you can talk openly with each other, knowing that we're going in the same direction, that we're giving each other the benefit of the doubt. And when you have that, nothing is off limits.
Okay, so let's go to the rapid fire questions now. I'll ask you 5 questions in rapid succession, and we'll aim at answering them in under 2 minutes.
Okay, great.
All right. Okay. So, what is your definition of organizational culture?
My definition of organizational culture is anything that feels normal and acceptable within an organization.
And what are the signs that a company culture needs some work, or perhaps even a major overhaul?
There are 2 signs, I think, that suggest that a culture might need some work. One is when you spend all your time having the same conversations over and over, and you feel like you're just beating your head against the wall, but you can't get through to anyone. So that's one. The second is when good, hardworking people within your organization are scared to speak up. That is definitely a bad sign. So I would say that those 2 are red flags to start taking a closer look at your culture.
Yeah, awesome. And what are the companies that you admire for their culture, and why?
I have a slightly different take on this question, and my point of view is that there's culture with a capital C, and then there's culture with a lowercase c. And I've personally joined organizations thinking that the culture is going to be one way, and realized that the subculture, the little c culture on my particular team, was different than the one from the broader culture. So that was a surprise, a jarring surprise to me, and it's happened a couple of times too with working with clients. So I think in my experience, it's hard to say a blanket, this entire company has a certain culture. What I will say is that I very much admire change agents within teams all across organizations, different organizations that are trying to do good work. And there are almost always change agents embedded. Sometimes they're hidden and need to come out of the woodwork. Other times they're working hard behind the scenes, but in almost every organization they exist. And I would love to see organizations support these change agents more and encourage them to amplify their work.
And what books on culture or on leadership would you recommend?
I would recommend Linchpin by my former boss, Seth. I know I'm drinking the Kool-Aid a little bit here, but it is one of the best books, I think, on thinking about personal responsibility and ownership and accountability, and not asking other people what they can do for us, but what we can do to give even more in the organizations we work in.
Yeah, I really agree. I think it's particularly fantastic for people working in organizations and bringing the change from within an organization. Great recommendation. Thank you. And what is one thing that our listeners could do tomorrow to build their own culture lab and start cultivating the sort of culture that will help them and their teams to bring their vision to life?
I think the one thing that listeners can do is to think about how to appeal to the interests of the specific audience that they need buy-in from. So whether that's your boss or your peers or your direct reports, if you want your team members to get excited about a certain project, how can you do a better job of selling that idea? And really shifting from this is legitimately a good idea into I really need to sell this regardless of whether it's a good idea. Taking that mentality of needing to sell the idea, needing to market the idea will make a big difference in the levers that you have available to get people excited about the work that you're doing.
Yeah. So what are any closing remarks that you have for our listeners? What would you like to leave them with?
I think I'd leave them with just acknowledging that culture change is very hard. Any kind of change is hard. And sometimes it feels like a slog, and it feels like you're, trying to make progress uphill, and it's slow, and sometimes it's thankless. But it's, if you feel like the journey is worth it, that the change that you're trying to make is worth it, stick at it. Keep thinking of different ways that you can appeal to the people that you want to change, and the different tools and frameworks that could help them get excited about a certain idea. And don't get discouraged. I think that's the main thing. I want to leave you with an analogy, one of my favorite, which is the duck analogy. We look around and we see everyone else, and they look like they're ducks gliding along the water. And it just looks like everyone else is having an easier time than us, right? But really, everyone is paddling really hard under the water, just like we are. We just don't see that. So keep paddling.
Yeah.
Keep paddling. It's worth it.
I love that. I think it's a beautiful image to leave our listeners with. So just in closing, Wes, if our listeners would like to learn more about you and about your work, what are the best places to direct them to?
I would direct you to my website, weskao.com, where I write a weekly blog about leadership, management, marketing, and also on Twitter. You can follow me there too.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for this interview. I really enjoyed speaking to you, and I'm already looking forward to having you another time on Culture Lab and continuing this conversation.
Awesome. Very, very excited about that. And thank you so much, Aga.
Thank you, Wes Kao, for being our guest, and thank you for listening. Thank you to our sound editor, James Eade of Be Heard, our production manager, Lindsay Nunes, our content editor, Rachel Nice, and our art director, Emily Spencer. And before we say goodbye, I want to give you a preview of our next interview with Claude Silver, who's the Chief Heart Officer of Viner Media, the company that was founded by Gary Vaynerchuk. Claude's job at Viner Media is to unlock employees' potential by forging human-to-human connection, creating cultures of belonging, empowering teams to be purpose-driven, efficient, and strong, and infusing the agency with empathy, humanity, and joy. Here is a short preview of our conversation.
When you are with people, and I really mean it, in an authentic place, when you have created a safe place for people to belong and to bring their whole selves to work, when you have created a culture that experiences diversity and inclusivity of all levels, race, ethnicity, sexuality, seen and unseen handicaps, when you have built a microcosm out of the macrocosm of this world, anything is possible. I truly believe that.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Culture Lab. If you found any moments that were interesting, inspiring, or maybe even game-changing, please share it with someone who'd appreciate it. After all, good ideas are meant to be shared.